Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
For too many decades, the M side of OMB played second fiddle to the budget side, but the Republican nominee for President George W. Bush and his team began charting a path to change that. The way the Bush administration pumped up the M side of OMB was with the introduction of the President's Management Agenda, or the PMA. As part of Federal News Network's 25th anniversary celebration, the PMA has been named a top moment in the last 25 years, and executive editor Jason Miller joins me now to tell us why. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Eric.
So let's start with a brief reminder of what PMA was back in 2001. I don't know where you were, but I certainly was not paying attention to it. So how has it evolved today, and where does it stand?
I was a big fan of the PMA back in 2001, Eric. That's how much I remember it. And you remember, the PMA actually started back during when candidate George W. Bush talked about a speech in Philadelphia in 2000. He talked about changing the way the government's managed. And it went on to become, with some help of many others, a scorecard using that traffic light system of red, yellow, green to measure progress against 5 management areas. Things like e-government and human capital management, something called competitive sourcing, which was under the moniker of A76. The idea, and really it continued over the next 2 decades, was to use these goals to publicly hold political and career leaders across the government accountable for how they successfully improved how the government works. Robert Shea is a former associate administrator for performance and accountability at OMB during the Bush administration. He's now the president of GovNavigators.
At the time we designed the PMA, the criteria we came up with were reflected in the most up-to-date work that the Government Accountability Office had performed identifying those challenges. So you can map the criteria to what GAO said were the biggest problems that needed to be fixed. So there was rigorous evidence that had to be supplied to prove that agencies were where they should be.
Now, OMB held monthly sessions reviewing agency progress. They did press conferences. I got to cover a lot of those press conferences to release the results and ask questions. They celebrated successes, and they actually used some public shaming for those agencies who struggled. Now, that idea of measuring outcomes, holding agencies and officials accountable continued over the next 20 years. Each administration did something a little different, but really the basic tenets of the PMA remained the same. Set some goals, either cross-agency or agency-specific, put a senior leader or a set of senior leaders in charge, and then publicly measure that progress.
Interesting. So why was this approach so effective in bringing management back to the forefront?
I think for the Bush administration, there were several reasons. I think first and foremost, the leadership. From the top down, President Bush to OMB Director Mitch Daniels to several Deputy Director for Managements, they all focused on the PMA, and they made it a big priority for them. And in fact, during cabinet meetings, the secretary with the best PMA scores actually sat closest to the president. So it was both a reward and an incentive. Now, Mark Everson was the Deputy Director for Management at OMB in the initial years of the Bush administration as it rolled out the PMA. He says the scorecard brought together the management and the budget side across the agencies and gave them a common set of goals.
It was a very simple tool that appealed to the competitive nature of the people who ran the cabinet departments and their deputies, because you could see, hey, all right, we're still yellow or we're still red. But on the progress side, if you weren't green, that was a problem. And you didn't want to stand out on this scorecard that the president would see once in a while. And so it was incredibly effective because the cabinet secretaries had a lot to do. And it was typically the deputy who was runs the management of the departments. And it was an easy way for them to see whether their things were working correctly or not. So that sort of pulled it together in a way.
Now, Eric, the other reason for the PMA's success was making OMB's resource management officers, or RMOs, in charge of all the grading. Now, these are the folks that usually handle budget preparations. They actually know their particular agency maybe better than anyone else. Danny Werfel is the former commissioner of the IRS, former OMB controller, and he started his career as a resource management officer at OMB during the Bush administration. Werfel says Daniels and Johnson were fine to play, quote-unquote, bad cop with agencies who weren't making enough progress.
What was critical at the time was the OMB leadership. At first, Mitch and Mark, and then ultimately Josh Bolton and Clay Johnson, consistently stood up for the OMB examiners who had the tough assignment of giving very proud political officials and civil servants failing grades and publicizing those failing grades. Those were not easy things to do. And so it did create a lot of tension, and credit to the OMB leadership for maintaining the robustness of the scorecard and not allowing, well, just do us a solid, Clay, just do us a solid, Josh, move us to green. They didn't. They kept it true to what the examiners determined.
A few years later, OMB added another layer of data and competition to the PMA through something called the Program Assessment Ratings Tool, or PART. Robert Shea ran the PART tool. He says OMB designed this tool to assess whether a program had clear goals, determine whether that program had good data to tell you whether it was achieving those goals, and of course, whether or not it was achieving those goals itself. So again, all these pieces and parts came together to create both competition, create both clear end goals, and then the top-down and bottom-up approach to make sure you reach those goals.
We're talking here with Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller about the history of the presidential management agenda. We've talked about the past now. Let's look towards the future. How should the PMA continue to evolve in this ongoing effort?
Without a doubt, each successive administration had put their own stamp on the PMA, each picking what they liked from previous efforts, building on them. And I think that's a good thing for agencies. You really don't want to stop a 4-year effort and start entirely over with a new one. That would mean new data collections, new systems, new goals. And that would take a lot to really get it going and really start seeing the difference. So credit to a lot of the administrations, no matter what side of the aisle, they want to show results quickly, and that's how they built it on. For instance, Danny Werfel says, going from the Bush to the Obama administration, the new OMB leadership found that too often agencies were studying to the test. They weren't actually improving program or management area progress. So it's getting to green was through a checklist. They knew what that checklist was. So the Obama folks changed the impact and the outcomes so agencies had a more targeted set of goals. Werfel says he'd like to see future PMAs drill down even further into specific agency goals.
When you're at the agency itself, the management challenges are often very unique to your environment and to your agency. And sometimes the common denominators feel less pressing than solving the problems that are right in front of you. And so I think the way to evolve this is to make I would, if I were writing the agenda today, I would lean more and have the center of gravity be more on the deputy secretary's specific bold priorities that are specific to that organization. And I would narrow and limit the common denominator ones or the enterprise ones to just a few key areas and try to make them as high stakes and as pressing as possible.
Daniel Werfel, again, former OMB controller, IRS commissioner, talking about how he'd like to see the PMA continue to evolve. Another approach for the PMA is actually be even more aggressive. Robert Shea says the Bush administration was what he called a little too incremental in measuring progress, and in retrospect, they could have been more forceful to initiate change.
I'd like to see the administration design a PMA framework that can bring order and collaboration to what they're trying to accomplish. When I began in OMB, I was given responsibility for improper payments. And that's an area where I can't say I'm that proud because we haven't really put a dent in reducing improper payments. And the government's slow to adopt proven technologies that can get at that problem. So as the administration stumbles to identify genuine fraud, I think using that framework to bring every agency together to focus on genuine fraud and proven practices that would reduce or prevent it. I think that's what I'd like to see.
Eric, we don't know what this Trump administration PMA will look like. We expect they will have one, but there's a lot we expected that it is not happening. So I guess time will tell how this will continue to evolve. But I think, everyone I talk to, a lot of the executives around the government believe that something like a PMA, having this in place, is important and it will continue to exist in one way or another.
Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller giving us the look back and look ahead for the presidential management agenda. Thank you so much, Jason.
Always a pleasure.
And you can find Jason's reporting on this topic at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.